I want to take a little look at ownership and permissions. So first of all, ownership. What is ownership? Well, a file, when it's created, or a directory, when it's created, they have to be owned by a user and a group. Technically, they have to be assigned a UID and a GID, which is a number that represents the user or a number that represents the group. But for practical purposes, when you look at a file or directory, you should see a username and a group name there. The user that creates is the one that generally owns that file or directory. Let's just take a look real quick. So if I look at this file that I've created, file.txt, this column indicates the user that owns it. This column indicates the group that owns it. So if I were to create a new file, car.txt, ls-l, car.txt, you can also see the user ID and the group ID. Let's assume now that I log in as a different user. We can check our users that exist, like here, by looking at Etsy password. So I'll switch over to Charlie, and if I touch some new file.txt, ls-l new file, you can see that the user owns, by default right now, any file or directory that we create is going to be owned by the user that actually creates it. So you can see once again the Charlie user owns this new dir, and the Charlie group is also has group ownership of this new dir. So looking back here, the chown command allows us to change the ownership of a file, or a directory. So if I come back here, and typically you're going to be doing this as a sudo user, or as the root user, but let me go back in as the user Joe for a moment. So let's say that I want to assign car to be owned by Charlie. Remember, car is owned by Joe right now. So we can do sudo chown, and this is going to be owned by Charlie user car.txt. And then we enter, and this has to be done by a user that actually has sudo permissions. So you can see now the Charlie user has been assigned ownership of the file. And same thing is true of a directory. Now let's look at, remember we created some groups in an earlier video. So if I look at Etsy group, I might have a nursing group, I created a cowboys group, and Joe and Fred belong to the cowboys group. So let's also modify car.txt to not only be owned by the Charlie user, but let's also assign the group ownership to be cowboys. So we can do sudo chown, same thing we did before, and in this case I'm going to do a colon, and I'm going to do cowboys, if I can spell it, to car.txt. And if you do ls-l, I just change the group ownership. And there's several other ways of changing the ownership, changing the group ownership at least of a file, but I usually do it like that. If you're changing the group, user and group ownership, we can say sudo chown, let's say Fred as the user owner, and nursing as the other owner. I'll just change this on as a group owner. And now you can see, if I look at file.txt, you can see that the group that owns it is Fred, or the user that owns it, I'm sorry, and the group that owns it is nursing. So it's important to understand who owns a file or directory, both from a user perspective and a group perspective.